My name is Dalia Nasser. I am 31 years old. And I want to tell you about the Sunday evening my mother looked across the dinner table and told me, calmly in front of my aunt, that I had always been a burden on this family. I want to tell you everything that led to that moment, because the moment itself is not the story. The moment is just where the story finally became impossible to ignore. I grew up in a house in the eastern part of the city, a wide two-story with a fig tree in the back garden that my father planted the year my parents moved in and tended with a dedication he rarely extended to anything else in his domestic life. The house was the thing my parents were proudest of. They talked about it the way some families talk about a child, with ownership and tenderness and a kind of careful maintenance of its image. The house was proof that they had done something correctly, that they had arrived somewhere. My sister Priya is 3 years older than me. She has my mother's laugh, my mother's quickness, my mother's way of entering a room and finding the center of it without appearing to try. From very early I understood that Priya was the version of a daughter my parents had hoped for, and that I was something that had arrived afterward, loved, I think, but not quite anticipated. Not quite legible to them. I was quieter. I read too much and talked too little, and I had a way of going still in social situations that my mother read as sulking and my father read as ingratitude, and that I now understand was simply the way I process things. School was fine for me. Not exceptional. Not disastrous. I graduated at 22 with a degree in architectural design from a state university, and I was proud of it, though I learned early not to bring it up around Priya, who had gone to a better school on a partial scholarship and graduated with honors and accepted a management trainee position before I had even handed in my final project. By the time I finished my degree, Priya had been promoted twice, and my mother had already developed the habit of telling her friends about Priya's career in a tone of voice that required no mention of mine. This is important background because what happened later did not come from nowhere. It came from a pattern that had been established over years, a quiet family accounting in which Priya's contributions were noted and celebrated, and mine were filed under a different category, the category of things that were fine, manageable, not requiring comment, not requiring gratitude. I was the daughter who was handling it, the daughter who did not need much. The daughter who, my mother once said to my aunt when she did not know I was in the hallway, was lucky she was independent because she had never made things easy. I heard that, and I went upstairs and I sat on the edge of my bed, and I thought about what it meant to be called independent by someone who meant it as an explanation for why they had not tried harder. And then I got up, and I made dinner, and I helped clear up afterward, and I drove home, and I did not say anything about what I had heard for a long time. By September 2020, I was 28 years old and working as a mid-level designer at an architecture firm in the city. I was earning $74,200 a year. I had a one-bedroom apartment 12 minutes from the office, a small but real savings account, and a project portfolio I was quietly proud of. I was up for a promotion, not confirmed, but discussed a real possibility that I had been working toward for 2 years. I was, by any reasonable measure, fine. Better than fine. I was building something. My parents were not fine. My father had spent most of his career as an independent business consultant, the kind of work that looks stable from the outside and is in fact subject to significant volatility. He had always managed, but managing had meant stretching, and the stretching had gotten harder. When the broader economy slowed in early 2020 and his client work dropped sharply, the gap between what came in and what the household costs became impossible to ignore. The mortgage on the family house was $2,847 per month. There were utility bills and a car payment and the various costs of maintaining a property that was 22 years old and had been deferred on since at least 2015. My mother called me on a Thursday evening at 9:17 p.m. I was standing in my kitchen eating crackers because I had not had time to buy groceries, and I remember the particular quality of tiredness I felt that evening, the kind that is not dramatic, just accumulated, the residue of a long week of small pressures. She told me they were struggling. She told me in the careful, abbreviated way my mother had of saying difficult things, which was to state the fact neutrally and then stop talking and let the silence do the work. She said the mortgage was unmanageable. She said Priya had just had her baby in August and could not contribute right now. She asked if there was anything I could do. I said yes. I said I would cover the mortgage for a few months while my father's work picked up. I said it immediately, without deliberating, because the house was the thing my parents were proudest of, and the idea of it being in danger was not something I was willing to stand next to and watch. I did the arithmetic that night on a piece of paper at my kitchen table and confirmed I could manage $2,847 a month without depleting my own savings, as long as it was genuinely temporary. My mother thanked me. She sounded relieved, and something in her voice was warmer than usual when she said goodbye, and she said she had known she could count on me. I want you to remember that she said that. I had known she could count on me. I set up the standing transfer in early January 2021. Every first of the month, $2,847 moved from my checking account to my parents' mortgage account. I did it quietly because in my family direct conversations about money were considered slightly embarrassing, a breach of a particular kind of dignity that my parents maintained carefully. I did not tell Priya. I did not make a point of telling my father. I simply sent the money.
January,
February,
March.
By April the money was still going, and my father had not mentioned a timeline. I did not push. I told myself the situation was genuinely difficult, and that patience was the appropriate response, and that things would resolve. I went to my parent house for Sunday lunch in late April, and my mother had made my father's favorite lamb dish, and there were fresh flowers on the table, and the afternoon was entirely ordinary and pleasant, and the mortgage payment was not mentioned.
May, June.
In June, I transferred the sixth payment. On the same day, or within a few days of it. I confirmed this later when I looked back at the dates. Priya posted photographs on her social media of a long weekend trip she had taken with her husband and the baby. A coastal resort. I remember looking at the photographs and feeling something I could not immediately name, something that was not quite resentment and not quite confusion but lived in the territory between them. I filed it away. I told myself it had nothing to do with the payments, that Priya's finances were her own business, and I had made my choice independently, and it was the right thing to do.
July,
August, September. In September, I went to my parents for my father's birthday. When I arrived, the kitchen had new appliances, a refrigerator with a bottom drawer freezer, a matching dishwasher, both still with the protective film on the handles. The refrigerator was the kind I knew cost at least $1,400 at the stores near their neighborhood. I noticed this, and I said nothing. My father seemed pleased and comfortable, and he carved the roast with the specific pleasure of a man who has recently had several things go right for him. We talked about his work, and he said it was picking up, slowly, which was the same thing he had been saying since April. October, November, December. I transferred the 12th payment on December 1st, 2021. The total I had sent by the end of that year was $33,164. I was not tracking this obsessively. I was tracking it the way you track something that matters, the way you keep a tally of something you have decided to do and want to do responsibly. I had a simple spreadsheet. Each row had a date, an amount, a running total, and a brief note. It was the most honest document in my life at that point, and I had not shown it to anyone. On a Sunday afternoon in late December, I called my mother. She was in good spirits. She mentioned that the neighbors had sold their property for an excellent price, and that my cousin's engagement was happening in the spring, and that the fig tree in the back garden had finally produced well this year after 2 disappointing seasons. I said that was good. She asked how work was going, and I told her I was still up for the senior associate position. She said that was nice. She asked if I had spoken to Priya recently. I said not this week. She said Priya had been incredible with the baby, just incredible, so natural. I said I was glad. I hung up and I sat in my apartment with the phone in my lap for a moment. Outside the window, the light was doing something specific to the buildings across the street, that late winter afternoon quality of light that is very clear and slightly merciless, and I thought about the 12th payment and the new refrigerator and the coastal resort photographs and the lamb dish and the pleasant April Sunday, and I thought, I do not know when this ends. The dinner was on a Sunday in February 2022. February 13th. I remember the date because the next day was Valentine's Day, and I drove home that evening thinking about the particular dark humor of spending the morning of February 14th beginning a legal process against the woman who raised me. My Aunt Rasha was visiting from out of town. She is my mother's older sister, warm in her own way, with a quality of careful diplomacy that I had always appreciated as a child and had come to understand, as an adult, as a form of studied neutrality that protected her own peace more than anyone else's. There were 6 of us at the table. My parents and my aunt, Priya and her husband Tariq and me. Priya's baby, 14 months old now, was upstairs in the guest room asleep. The dinner had been good. My mother's lamb again, roasted vegetables, bread she had baked that morning. The conversation had been the normal conversation of that table. The baby's developmental milestones, a property dispute involving a family friend, my father's opinions about infrastructure, my aunt asking Priya about her promotion last quarter. Priya said it wasn't really a promotion in the formal sense, just a restructure. My mother said leadership was leadership. Earlier in the week, I had told my mother I was being considered for the senior associate position at the firm. She had said that was nice and asked if I had eaten because I sounded tired. At the dinner table that Sunday, my aunt turned to me and asked how work was going. I said it was going well. I was being considered for a promotion, senior associate, something I had been working toward for 2 years. I said it simply, not as a bid for attention, just as the honest answer to a direct question. My mother, without looking up from her plate, said, "That's nice. Priya was made head of her department last quarter." Priya said a little awkwardly that it was just the restructure, not a real promotion in the formal sense. My mother shrugged and said that didn't matter, that it was still leadership. And then she set down her fork and she looked at me and her voice did not change at all, not harder, not warmer, just the same measured dinner table voice she had used to discuss the neighbor's property sale, and she said, "You've always been a burden on this family, Dalia. Priya contributes. You've always taken. That's just the truth of it." My aunt looked down at her plate. Tariq looked at his water glass. Priya looked at her husband. My mother picked up her fork. I looked at her, and I noticed, with a detachment that surprised me in the moment and makes complete sense to me now, that she genuinely believed what she had said. There was no cruelty in it in the way that cruelty requires some awareness of the wound it is making. It was simply a position she held, a settled fact in the accounting she carried about her family, the way you carry a position about the weather or the traffic or some other feature of the world that simply is what it is. I was a burden. I had always been one. She had no reason to doubt this because for 14 months I had sent the money without saying so. And silence had allowed her version of me to remain completely intact. I said, "I see." And I folded my napkin and set it on the table and said I needed some air, and I took my water glass and I went and sat on the back step. It was cold. The fig tree was bare. The yard looked smaller in February than it did in summer, the borders more defined, the space less forgiving. I sat there for 11 minutes. I did not cry. I was not angry in the way I would have expected to be angry. I was something quieter than that, something that had to do with finally understanding the distance between what I had believed was happening and what had actually been happening all along. Something inside me steadied. Not hardened. Not broke. Steadied, the way a surface steadies after you stop pressing against it. I went back inside. I helped clear the table. I said goodbye to my aunt with a hug, and I told her it was good to see her. And I meant it. I drove home at 9:52 p.m., and I parked outside my building, and I sat in the car with the engine off. The March payment was 6 days away. I did not go upstairs immediately. I sat in the car for a while with my hands in my lap, and I thought clearly about a few things. I thought about the January 2021 transfer, and the one after that, and the one after that, the 14 of them, the specific odd number of $2,847 appearing 14 times in a column in my spreadsheet. I thought about the new refrigerator with the film still on the handles. I thought about the coastal resort. I thought about my mother's voice saying she had known she could count on me, the warmth in it, the relief, and I thought about her voice at dinner saying I had always been a burden. These were not two different people. They were the same person, holding both things simultaneously, and the way she held them was not as a contradiction. In her accounting, they were consistent. I was the one she could count on when money was needed, and I was still the burden because the money I sent was not visible to her as contribution. It was invisible. I had made it invisible. I had sent it without saying so because the alternative, asking to be acknowledged, asking to be seen, asking for the conversation I should have had 14 months earlier, had felt like it required more of me than I had at the time. I went upstairs and I made tea and I opened my laptop and I looked at the spreadsheet and I did not calculate the total because I already knew it. 14 payments of $2,847. $39,858. I looked at that number for a while. Then I opened a new document and I began to think about what I needed. I called Mina Sadaki's office the next morning at 8:45 a.m. I had her number from a lease review she had helped me with in early 2022, and I trusted her because she had a quality I needed then and still need now. She listened to a problem until it had a shape, and then she told me what the shape meant in practical terms without opinion or judgment about how I had arrived at it. I met her at her office at 2:30 p.m. on February 14th. I brought everything: the bank statements printed out in full, the transfer records, the email from October 2020 in which my mother had first described the situation and asked for help, and a series of text messages from the months that followed. I had the December 2021 text in which my mother had written verbatim, "The payments are keeping us afloat. We just need a little more time." I had it on my phone, and I had printed it. Mina looked at the documents for a long time. She picked up the bank statements twice and looked at the running total column. She did not react. Then she asked, "What is your goal?" I said I wanted two things. First, I wanted to stop the payments immediately and without dispute. I wanted to cancel the March transfer and have that be the end of my financial obligation to this mortgage, without my family characterizing my withdrawal as abandonment or as a crisis I had created. Second, I wanted the transfers documented as a loan, not a gift, so that when the house was eventually sold or transferred, I had a documented claim to repayment. Mina said the loan documentation was achievable, but would require my family's cooperation, which was not guaranteed. She said the first goal, stopping the payments cleanly, with a clear record, was entirely achievable, and she could structure a letter that established the transfer history, the informal loan arrangement, my mother's own text acknowledgement, and my intention to discontinue payments as of March 1st, while inviting my family to respond and discuss repayment in good faith. She began preparing it that afternoon. Over the following week, she drafted and refined it, incorporating the bank records and the text correspondence, and on a Thursday morning, she sent it to my parents' address by registered mail. 4 pages. Neutral in tone. Every number exact. Every date correct. My mother's own words quoted back to her in the third paragraph. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. My mother called me at 7:43 a.m. I was at my desk. I let it go to voicemail. 7:51 a.m. Voicemail. 8:04 a.m. Voicemail. 8:22 a.m. I watched my phone vibrate on the desk next to my keyboard, and I picked up my coffee cup, and I kept working. 8:35 a.m. 8:49 a.m. 9:02 a.m. By 11 a.m., she had called 11 times. By 3 p.m., 19. By the time I left the office at 6:15 p.m. and walked to my car in the cold gray afternoon, the count was 26 missed calls. I listened to the first voicemail during my lunch break, standing outside the building with my coat pulled against the wind. My mother's voice in the recording was not the voice she had used at the dinner table. That voice had been flat and unhurried and sure of itself. This voice was higher and slightly breathless, and she used the word misunderstanding 3 times in 90 seconds. She said she was sure there had been a misunderstanding. She said she had always been grateful for everything I had done. She said she did not understand why I needed to involve an attorney in a family matter, and that she would really appreciate it if I called her back, so they could sort this out between themselves. I saved the voicemail, and I went back inside, and I ate my lunch at my desk. My father called the following day, Thursday, at 8:17 a.m. I had not expected that. He and I had always communicated in a mode of mutual avoidance. We loved each other in the way that people love each other across a significant gap in understanding, with warmth and almost no directness. He left one voicemail. It was shorter than my mother's. He said he had read the letter. He said the amounts were more than he had realized. He said he was sorry about what had happened at dinner, which was the closest my father had ever come in my memory to a direct apology, and the fact that it arrived this way, by voicemail 3 days after a legal letter, 22 years into my life, said something I did not need to analyze at length. By Friday of that week, 31 missed calls combined between my parents' numbers. 3 voicemails from my mother, 1 from my father. 1 text from Priya on Thursday evening that said, "Can you call me? I need to understand what's happening." I had canceled the March transfer on the Tuesday evening the letter arrived, before I had heard any of the voicemails, before I knew how many times my mother would call. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop, and I navigated to the transfer portal, and I found the standing instruction, and I canceled it. The confirmation appeared on the screen, and I looked at it for a moment. 14 months. $39,858. And now a blank space where the instruction had been. I closed the laptop and made dinner. Pasta, something simple. I ate it at the table, and I sat with the quiet of the apartment for a while, which was a different kind of quiet than it had been before. Not empty. Just mine. I called Priya back on the Saturday. I had debated it, but she was my sister, and she had not been unkind to me at the dinner, and she had asked to understand, which was more than the others had done. She answered on the second ring. She said she had read the letter. My parents had shown her a copy, and she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I didn't know you were doing that." I said I knew she didn't. She said, "How long?" I said 14 months. There was a silence. Then she said, "Dalia, I'm sorry." I genuinely didn't know. And then, after another pause, I would have said something. If I had known. I believed her. I still believe her. Priya and I have a complicated history woven from years of the kind of family dynamic neither of us designed, but she is not a cruel person, and she had not known. Nobody had known except my mother, and, in the vague way of someone who does not examine what he does not wish to examine, my father. My mother came to see me in person on a Saturday morning 3 weeks later, March 12th. She wore her good coat, the navy one she reserved for occasions that required her to conduct herself formally. She sat at my kitchen table, and she said that she had not meant what she said at the dinner table the way I had taken it. She said she had been tired and stressed for a long time, and sometimes things came out wrong. She said she had always been proud of me, that I had always been capable and independent, and that she had perhaps relied on that too much and had not said enough about what it meant to her. I let her finish. Then I said, "I need you to understand what the letter says, Mom."
Not as an attack.
As a record. 14 payments. $39,858. From my account to your mortgage. For 14 months. While you were telling people I was the one who didn't contribute. She was quiet. The morning light was coming through my kitchen window at a low angle, and I remember the way it lay across the table between us, and the way my mother's hands were folded in front of her on the surface of it. She said, "I didn't know it was that much." I said, "I know you didn't. That's the whole point." She looked at her hands for a long time. Then she said very quietly, "Why didn't you tell me?" It was a fair question. I had asked myself the same thing during the drive home from her house that February Sunday, sitting in the cold car outside my building, and in the days after. Why hadn't I told her? Part of it was the family's established grammar around money, the way we did not discuss it directly, the slight indecorousness of it. Part of it was that I had not wanted anyone to feel indebted or uncomfortable. But the deeper part, the part one had been sitting with for 3 weeks, was this. I had believed that the act of helping, performed quietly and consistently, and without asking for acknowledgement, would eventually shift something in the way my mother saw me. I had believed that if I showed up reliably enough for long enough, the contribution would become visible on its own. I told her this. Not all of it, not in those words, but the core of it. I said, "I thought if I just kept doing it, you would notice eventually." She looked up at me, and in her face I saw something I had not expected, which was shame, not the performing kind, not the defensive kind, but the real kind, the kind that comes from understanding something about yourself that you had not previously understood, and finding it uncomfortable to hold. She said, "I should have looked harder." Mina reached an agreement with my parents in May. No lawsuit was filed. The transfers were formally documented as a loan in a signed agreement. Repayment terms were modest, $300 per month, given their situation, but they were documented and my father signed without argument. The agreement also noted that I would not be asked to contribute to household expenses in the future without a written arrangement. Mina sent me a copy of the signed document by email at 4:23 p.m. on a Tuesday in May, and I read it once at my desk and saved it to a folder and closed the laptop and went for a walk because it was the kind of late spring afternoon that is worth being outside in. I am not estranged from my family. I want to be clear about that because I think these stories are sometimes heard as being about rupture, about the satisfying dramatic cutting of ties, and that is not what this is. I still have Sunday lunches with my parents. My mother still makes the lamb. My father still tends the fig tree. Priya and I speak every week or two, which is more than we did before all of this, and the conversations are more honest than they used to be in a way that has made them, unexpectedly, more comfortable. What is different is that there is no silence now where money is concerned. There is a document. The document changed something in how my mother speaks to me, not dramatically, not with any announcement, but in the accumulation of small adjustments. She asks how things are going and waits for the answer. She mentioned my promotion, which came through in April, to my aunt without immediately pivoting to Priya's. These are small things, and I hold them with appropriate proportion. I am not waiting for a transformation. I am observing a gradual shift in furniture arrangement, the slow acknowledgement that the room was laid out wrong. Some families do not realize they have turned you into a resource until the resource stops being silent. My mother had not been calculating or malicious. She had simply been operating within a framework she had never been asked to examine, one in which I was the capable one, the one who handled it, the one who did not require the focused attention that visible need requires. I had reinforced this framework for 14 months by sending money without speaking. The attorney's letter was not an act of cruelty. It was the first time I had said, in language that could not be reinterpreted, "Here is what I've been doing. Here is what it costs. Here is what I need to happen now." The truth, written in numbers, has a clarity that feelings cannot always achieve. I learned something practical from all of this that I want to give you before we close, because I think the most useful stories leave you with something you can carry. If you are funding something in your family, a mortgage, a bill, a gap that nobody names, make sure there is a record, a transfer log, a text acknowledgement, something in writing that confirms the nature of the arrangement. Not because you are planning a betrayal, not because you do not trust the people you love, but because a record is how a fact stays a fact, even when time passes and feelings shift and memory becomes convenient. The records I kept were the reason the attorney's letter was possible. Without them, I would have had the pain and none of the leverage. Keep the records. And before I go, I want to ask you something. If you were in Dalia's position, if your mother had looked across the dinner table and called you a burden while you were covering her mortgage every single month, would you have sent the attorney's letter and allowed her the privacy of reading it alone first? Or would you have opened your banking app that same night at the dinner table and shown her the 14 payments in silence?